have a sort of schism between thinking about what's going on in the city and what's going on in terms of the organisation of the labour force in struggle with capital. And it's always seemed to me that we should pay much more attention to the question of who produces and reproduces urban life. And if we change the idea of production away from production of widgets in a factory or production of automobiles or production of coal or something like that, to the question of who produces the city and who reproduces the city, who produces spatial organisation, then you start to get a very different definition of who is the proletariat and what that proletariat is about. And for me, of course, having done a great deal of work on what happened in Second Empire Paris and what produced the Paris Commune, it was pretty clear to me that it was not an industrial proletariat that produced the Commune. Certainly there were artisans heavily involved, but many of the people who were involved were the stonemasons, the builders, and many other people who were actually supporting urban life. And to claim that the Commune, Paris Commune, was a uniquely proletarian event seemed to me to suggest that we needed a much broader definition, even back then, who was or was not the proletariat. So that is, if you like, one of the first ideas that seemed to me very important. But when you took that and you started to look at the whole history of urban-based struggles, you see a whole series of urban-based revolts, revolutions, rebellions, of which the Paris Commune was just one. And all of them had, I think, a certain significance historically in terms of what happened and why. In this country, for example, there was the Seattle General Strike in 1919, which we don't talk about, but it was an urban event. And it was about the city. Cordoba in 1969. It was the Shanghai Commune back in the 20s and again in the 60s. There have been events, the Petrograd Soviet, I mean, you just sort of go on. And beyond that, what you see is it's not only single cities that are involved, but frequently whole networks of cities become involved. If you look back at the revolutions of 1848, what you would see, it wasn't only Paris. It was Paris, it was Frankfurt, it was Milan, it was Vienna, it was Warsaw. If you look at 1968, it wasn't simply Paris again, it was Chicago, it was Paris, it was Mexico City, it was Bangkok. I mean, and in recent times, one of the events which struck me as very significant that everybody forgets about was the events on February the 15th, 2003, when simultaneously in some 200 cities around the world there were huge demonstrations against the prospect of a war with Iran, with something like 3 million people on the streets of Rome, 2 million in Madrid, 1.5 million, maybe 2 million in Barcelona, 1.5 million in Britain. How many have tried to get in New York, we never know, because Bloomberg said you couldn't march anywhere and nobody knew who could get out of the subways because everything was jammed. The urban network is a political institution, and it contains a set of political possibilities. And if you look at least recent events, we see the uprising, of course, which concentrates in Cairo and Tahrir Square. We see events like Madison. We see what is going on in Syria right now. Where's the revolt located? It's in cities like Homs and so on. And what we see in Latin America are events like those in Cochabamba, those in El Alto, and those which did not succeed, probably, like Oaxaca. So what we're looking at is a history of tremendous struggles which have had an urban focus. And one of the questions which then follows is the city simply a site where it just happens, the class struggle unfolds? Well, there's some truth to that idea. But nevertheless, the qualities of the city play a very important role in exactly how that revolt unfolds. I mean, one of the big stories about Haussmann in Paris was that he rebuilt the boulevards to try to curb the prospect of another revolution, like what happened in 1848. He was notably unsuccessful in that. But the redesign of many American cities after the urban revolts of the 1960s in this country, which again, there's many cities involved, the urban design became important because what we, in effect, found ourselves was highways were neatly engineered to protect the downtown high-value property from potentially arrested populations. There were moats constructed, if you like, around the citadels of capital. So there's a sense that the urban has to be controlled, and urban control becomes terribly important on that side, but also that the urban can be used by organising and mobilising neighbourhoods around kind of collective forms of struggle. And then it seemed to me that when you went back and looked at the most successful histories of factory-based struggles, the best ones nearly always worked because there was very, very strong mobilization in the surrounding communities. And it's very impressive in Argentina. Many of the occupied factories have gone out of their way to turn themselves into neighborhood institutions, cultural institutions, educational institutions. So when the owners come back and try to recuperate the factory, like take the machinery or something like that, everybody in the neighborhood turns out and represents it. So when you have massive support from the population around and that unity between what's going on in the factory and what's going on in the living space, struggles work much better. But the left has often not been prepared to acknowledge that underlying unity. And so one of the things I wanted to suggest was we should really be thinking better about how to put all of those elements together in terms of an organized attempt to create an alternative to the kind of capitalist world in which we currently live. And it also turns out that there's a lot of exploitation, of course, that occurs in the living space. I mean, one of the ways in which the bourgeoisie survives is it can concede wage concessions to workers. And then when the workers take their wage packets home, they suddenly find it all disappears because the landlords steal it back, or the merchants steal it back, or today, far more likely to be the credit institutions and the banks and the financiers steal it back. Capital doesn't care where it realizes the surplus value. Does it realize it in the workplace, or does it realize it in the living space? And increasingly we have an economy of dispossession, which is working in the living space, which is compensating for the fact that they're not managing to make too much in the way of extracting surplus value out of the workspaces. So all of this suggests to me that we should be really thinking seriously about these underlying unities and thinking about the organizational forms that we can build. And out of that comes, I think, a sense that in building those organizational forms, we might want to think about the question of how do you organize a whole city? How do you organize it as a bastion of class struggle? How do you then organize a whole series of cities so they become a network of cities? This actually was how capital broke free of feudalism. Things like the Hanseatic League. Well, imagine if we had a league of socialist cities, what that would look like. Wonderful idea, wonderful image. But we never really think in those terms. And I'm kind of saying, well, we should be thinking and imagining in those terms and working towards the possibility that this is a way to go. The other thing about organizing a whole city is it moves us up a notch in the scale problem. We have a lot of organizational forms right now that look very good from the standpoint of organizing very small scale units. The factory occupations, community organisation, and things of that sort. When you start to think about organising a whole city, you have to think about organisational forms that are not simply horizontal, but they also have to be vertical and they have to be, integrated with each other. We have to think about what's the relationship between politics at different scales within the political system. And so, from that standpoint also, it seems to me that we need to think about organizational forms actually respond to what seemed to me to be the crucial need right now, which is to find an alternative to the capitalist forms of urbanization. As I put it in the book, I think our task in some ways is to try to build a socialist city on the ruins of a capitalist urbanization process, which has been highly destructive of social relations, highly destructive environmentally, highly destructive in terms of the possibility of having a genuinely political kind of life, highly destructive of the urban commons, highly destructive of many of the institutional forms that once existed to give some sort of coherence to what the city was or could be about. So those are some of the general themes that I try to broach at the end there. And it's in that context that I see Occupy Wall Street as beginning to sort of move, as many movements have, through and across urban institutions and urban life, and start to organize so that people are working on the foreclosures, some are working on the student debt. There are many aspects of this all being brought together. And I think the big question for us is, can we package that in such a way to say, this is how we are going to move towards creating an alternative to a capitalist mode of production, which has reached, I think, its end point. Its shelf life is out. And what we're seeing, I think, is, today I read that formerly Europe is now back in recession, and Britain is back in recession. And they're saying a double-dip recession has arrived. Well, believe you me, we're going to be in a triple-dip recession very soon, and this is kind of the future that we're facing. So we've really got to start thinking about alternatives. So with that, let me just turn it over to David, and let David sort of talk a little bit about his perspective on some of these things, and particularly his much closer involvement in working with Occupy Wall Street and where that has gone and where it's going.
Okay. Is the microphone working? Can people hear me? Well, thanks so much for having me here. By the way, I apologize for the silly costume. I actually, it's not totally an act of whimsy. I was actually at an action earlier in Union Square where we were ceremonially destroying a giant loan statement and declaring the biblical jubilee, and the Reverend Billy came out in his preacher outfit, and I had to have something to match it, so I found this old Oddfellows costume I picked up and used in place of Boston. Got a matching hat, and sort of Roman themes seemed to work. But I had to rush her from there. But yes, I have actually been involved sometimes more deeply, sometimes less, sometimes actually acting, sometimes writing about it since the summer when we were first trying to put together the occupation at Zuccotti Park. And between activism and constantly having to write, one of the things that I never ever get to do is to read a book. There really isn't any time for it. And as I'm really grateful for events like this, because I kind of have to read the book. Right? if I come to an event like this, so I got to read it, and I'm very excited. I think it's a really wonderful work that throws out all sorts of ideas and challenges that I think we are trying to beginning to think about in practical ways in the movement itself. I mean, as you probably know, the situation of Occupy Wall Street, we had this kind of moment of national effervescence. So it's kind of remarkable to me because I was involved in the global justice movement, and I was one of those diehards who was never willing to admit that it was over. We kept on going after 9/11, after 2003, Miami, the repression got particularly intense. But every year there was another thing where we said to ourselves, no, this is it. We're back now. It's going to be the same thing. Prefigured politics, direct democracy, direct action, it's going to become contagious. Every year we kind of got ourselves convinced it was going to happen, and then it never did. And at some point, I think you really get to the point where you don't even really believe it's going to happen. You're just telling yourself it. So your life is kind of organized around this thing that you don't really believe is actually possible on some level anymore. And then it happened. There we were, and did this Occupy Wall Street thing, which was something that was kind of handed us by adbusters that threw out this idea, just as they had many times before, incidentally, and sort of let it drift, because I guess they had this idea that you just put something out on the internet and it kind of happens on the internet, which isn't really true. A lot of people sort of decided we would use this as a sort of excuse more than anything else to create a movement based on principles of direct democracy, general assemblies, and suddenly it took. It just like, after 3 weeks, I really couldn't believe I had to wake up and pinch myself. A lot of us had the same experience, like, there's 500 occupations across America? What happened? Why did it work? And I spent a lot of time thinking about why that is. And it's interesting, I think I'll talk about what happened. Well, I should talk also about what's happened since. As we know, there was a huge outpour. Suddenly the media was actually talking about what was happening, which was shocking. I've been dealing with the American media on and off for 10 years. And I remember the first time I did an interview with Canadian media before Direct Action in Quebec City. And I looked at the piece that came out and I said, oh my God, they wrote down what I actually said. That had never happened to me before in America. The American media system was systematically hostile to movements like this. And there's a brief window where they seemed to open up there. They were even willing to admit to police violence because, Gandhian strategies, which is what we were basically pursuing, where you show that no matter how nonviolent you are, the authorities will react with vicious violence if you challenge certain principles. It's very hard to do that in America. The last people who did it on a mass scale successfully were the civil rights movement. Because the media didn't report it that way. Media can't report officially sanctioned police behavior as violence, no matter what they do. But suddenly they did. The famous pepper spray incident, the Brooklyn Bridge arrests. There was something very interesting happened. On the ground, tactically, we pretty much won. The first eviction from Zuccotti Park, we managed to stop it. Bloomberg had to block down. A month later, something happened, and there was this wave, kind of coordinated wave of evictions across America, affected through extraordinary brutality. And for one reason or another, the media sort of just dropped the story. We don't know how these things happen, but what it's led to is a real split. I mean, the official narrative is that there were all these dissensions with the NOWS. And, there was some of that, partly because people were in shock and things, when you don't have an immediate camp to run. All these tensions that had existed before sort of come out. We went through a couple of months of great recrimination. We bounced out of it. But when we showed up again, we discovered that, in fact, in a lot of ways, we'd sunk much deeper roots. And most people don't know that we have things like occupied farms. I think there's 15 occupied farms in New York State now. We have incredible level and diversity of different projects, from occupied foreclosed homes to library projects to medical projects. I mean, anything you can possibly imagine. We really are at work trying to reinvent another society. And it's been deepening and broadening. Actually, our slogan, blow up color, but I always liked it, seems most appropriate to what happened is a fuck us and we multiply. All over we're having new versions of OWS and new manifestations. Yet, in the spring, as we're re-emerging, we're facing an enormous level of repression, and which, for some reason, is no longer a news story. So, the most critical thing, I think that's happened, that's changed Occupy Wall Street, is there's a slow transformation of class alliances. Liberal organizations and well-meaning liberal people got involved in mass numbers in the original occupations. In fact, a lot of these people didn't even understand that they were joining a group that was founded basically on anarchist principles of direct democracy and direct action, which is fine. But when it came to the inevitable police repression, there has been a kind of a split. I always say that, well, there's a kind of traditional terms of alliance between the liberals and radicals in American social movements, which is essentially that we create, we the radicals, create a fire on your left, so that you become relevant again, and your various reformist projects, people will listen to them, since you seem like the more moderate alternative to us. And so we create a fire to your left to make you relevant, and you keep us out of jail. Some basic civil liberties issues is what the essential role of the larger NGOs and groups like MoveOn and that got heavily involved ought to be, at least from our perspective, and there was this colossal failure in that regard. Once the violence began in earnest, it was not made into a national issue. Most people are not aware, for example, I'm just going to throw something out. In Egypt, in November, a lot of people heard of this, when they started reoccupying Tahrir Square, security forces' tactics suddenly shifted to a sort of calculated campaign of sexual violence. Not only were they beating people, but like systematically groping women and stripping people. When we started trying our reoccupation of Zuccotti Park on March 17th, and continually since the Union Square occupation, now the occupation on Wall Street itself, suddenly the American police started doing the same thing. We hadn't really had reports of this, any significant reports of this earlier, but suddenly, we have these incidents where they're like systematically grabbing women's breasts. And I have friends with 5 times in one day from 5 different officers. There's this sort of campaign, and not to a friend of mine, this happened to at Zuccotti Park, and she sort of yelled, the cops called her pervert, so they took her behind the lines and broke her wrists. This is the kind of level of violence that we've been talking about right here in the city. And I think that a lot of our former allies are horrified at making a case about this, or even confronting the fact that this is going on, because it tells us something about what kind of society we really live in. We have militarization and securitization of even everyday life in a city like New York. So as a result, a lot of our attention has been placed on issues of police brutality, but as a result also, there's been a shift of alliances, which in a way I think is actually kind of healthy. We are turning much more to alliances with groups that know a lot about this sort of treatment and know how to deal with it. We've been dealing much more with unions, and especially radical groups within unions, of which there is a burgeoning number of grassroots groups within larger unions that are experimenting with horizontal decision-making and more radical democratic forms. We've been talking a lot with immigrant groups. May Day, which will be happening quite soon, is going to be, in some ways, a repeat of the famous Day Without an Immigrant May Day mobilizations. Rain, among other things, the day about the 99%. But we also, so we've been working with immigrant groups, and we've also got a lot of unions on board, which is actually a real historical shift in America, because it's going to mark the first time that really large number of American unions are celebrating Labor Day on the day that the rest of the world celebrates. I think that's symbolically very important. So this is where Occupy Wall Street is at. We're really at a convergence point where there's a deeper turning to communities. We're talking about things like workplace occupations. We're talking about creating community general assemblies and councils. We're experimenting with a broad range of forms of self-organization. And this is exactly the moment, I think, that thinking about theory is really important. And I think David Harvey's book is really helpful here, because one problem we have had, and it's almost inevitable in a way, is that it's like the generals are always fighting the last war. The social theory that becomes identified with a social movement of social mobilization tends to be that drawn from the last round. So that classically in the globalization movement, the altered globalization movement of around 2000, 2001, the sort of theoretical works that really got pulled out and were seen as being the sort of embodiment of the movement were Cardin Negri's Empire, and autonomous theory that really came out of the 1970s in Italy. At the moment, we're having a resurgence of stuff, in a way, my own writings from around 2000 in some quarters are being developed in the same way for a movement 10 years later. And it might be nice for once in history to actually create theory relevant to this moment rather than the last time around. I think that reconsidering the role of the city is really critical there. We're at a moment in Occupy Wall Street where we're sitting down and we're trying to deepen our own theoretical perspectives. We're actually calling are talking about, creating a series of conversations, open conversations about visions, about organizational questions, about the very kind of questions of scale that David raises in the book, and which we haven't had the opportunity, unfortunately, to handle practically, but we'd like to get to the point where we will. Now, it strikes me that one of the most important insights, the thing that I pulled out of this that really stayed with me as critical is discussing the role of the proletariat and labor, the creation of the city. Because we're really stuck with an old-fashioned paradigm about work, it seems to be. And the composition, classical composition, I can use the term, that we're seeing emerging in Occupy Wall Street is really interesting in that regard. Because here we have a series of cities in largely deindustrialized sections of America, where we still have a working class, but we have class alliances that look really different than anything that we've seen in any period I'm aware of. If you think about it this way, the TWU, the Transit Workers Union, is one of the strongest allies of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So much so that TWU is actually still suing the New York Police Department for commandeering their buses to take away the people arrested in the Brooklyn Bridge protest. TWU has been amazing. But if you think about the occupation of the Graeber, it was the single largest group of people who spearheaded that initial occupation were young people who were either students or recently had been students, saddled with enormous student loan debt. Now, the reason why this is significant is, well, the plight of a group of indebted ex-college students is not the sort of thing that really would have spoken immediately to the heart of transit workers through most of American history. Why is it that right now there's this strong alliance and identification? 10 years ago it would not have been the case. Like 40 years ago it would hardly have been the case. I mean, I still talk to people who are veterans of Wall Street protests in, say, 1970, the late 60s and early 70s, when construction workers would come in like with 2x4s and physically attack them. So the class alliances really profoundly changed here. And we need to understand why and how that's happening. One reason I think it's happening has to do with the nature of capitalism itself and forms of surplus extraction. I think most of us are aware of the phenomenal financialization of capitalism. At this point, only 16% of corporate profits are derived from industry, and even that's wildly overstated because that includes, for example, the profits of General Motors, which at this point are largely coming from their financial division, and not from the actual production of cars at all. The vast majority, or the single largest share, comes from finance, but like 30% of profits come from the fire sector at this point, at least? 40 at this point, yeah. And the interesting thing that we don't know is how much of the average American's income is actually directly appropriated in that way. This struck me as profound when I started looking at trying to get the numbers that we can't. I mean, there's no one place where you can find these numbers tabulated. You can get the amount that are paid in loans, you can get the amounts, but it usually doesn't include things like late fees, which often come to 50%, especially with student loans. Various fees, penalties, service charges. If you tabulate it all, the closest I could come, it sounded like it was about 18%. Well, that's really significant. And especially when you consider that is wildly disproportionately distributed according to class, race, and other demographic factors in income in general. So that there are people from 40% of their income, a lot of families in America, 40% of their income goes to student loans alone. If you look at what happened in 2008, for example, you find that the actual total amount of indebtedness and the amount of people's income that they were paying in loans actually plummeted very, very quickly. It's one of the sharpest drops I've ever seen on any chart, actually. Because everybody who actually could deleverage themselves and get themselves out of debt seemed to be doing so. People with mortgages, people with credit card debt were trying to liquidate it. The two types of debt that people really don't seem to have been able to get out of were precisely student loans, which went up rather sharply during this period. And things like subprime mortgages, and sort of debts owed by the working poor, who are, of course, inordinately dependent on incredibly extravagant rates of interest that you get from payday loans and other extremely parasitical, predatory lending. So all of a sudden, the working poor and the college student are substituted in a rather structurally similar position. They're the people who can't pull themselves out of the grip of Wall Street. So a movement that highlights essentially the degree to which our economy has become, the profit base of Wall Street itself has become a sort of system whereby it can take money directly from you, redistribute it to politicians who allow them to write the regulations which supposedly regulate the corporations, which then give them the right to take even more money from you. Particularly speaks to both those sections of the population. I think, it makes us question the very nature of what's happening to capitalism itself. Now, obviously, when I was in college, I learned a very simplistic version of the sort of Perry-Anderson version of capitalism versus feudalism, where capitalism extracts their surplus indirectly through the wage, and when you take the surplus through juro-political means, that's called feudalism. It's a simplistic thing to say that it's turning into a more feudalistic form of capitalism. Rent-taking has always been an element. But there's been a shift within capitalism, rather remarkably, which explains the changing natures of class alliances, and we need a theory that can take that on. I think that reimagining labor itself is, we really do have the shackles of very old-fashioned notions. And I think one of the most wonderful things about the book is how effectively it challenges that. If you think of making a city, what is this productive labor? Labor of production. When we think of labor, we think of production as being the paradigm for labor. But most of the labor that we spend is in maintaining things. A building is a beautiful example. Is it produced? It's produced. It's maintained. It's changed. It's transformed. The paradigms for labor that we use are very much built on examples that Marx used, not because he thought that factory labor was the major form of labor, but because he was taking certain political he's not writing a work of political economy, he's writing a critique of political economy. He's taking certain assumptions from the political economists of his day, saying, well, even if this is true, we can demonstrate that the system is profoundly contradictory and will ultimately destroy itself. But the problem is we then take that as if that he is presenting to us as the literal truth of what's going on. Labor has always been a much more complex thing. And I think that the social composition of current social movements can only be explained by about a change in the nature of labor that we don't completely understand. And I think that the way that it's largely been taken on theoretically has been coming out of that Italian autonomous tradition, which I think gets a half right. I think that they're profoundly right when they say that much of the capitalism doesn't really create anything. To a large degree, it appropriates the creativity of the working classes, and not just in way that in factory production, but on every level. I think your example, the creation of urban neighborhoods, is a beautiful example. In a lot of ways, all the best things in modern life are the creations of the working class, but they're creations of the working class when they're not working. Everything from shish kebab stands to rock and roll are essentially working class creations during the hours they have off. But even more than that, I think that to really understand what's happening, we need to, I would say, rather than the sort of rhetoric of the material labor biopower to get into, but I think it's profoundly problematic. The most useful theoretical way to approach this might be to combine Harvey's insights into the nature of the city and the production of urban environment, the feminist tradition, which I do think that we need to pay more attention to, because they've been handling these questions for a lot longer than anyone. What form of labor do we think of as paradigmatic? To some degree, it's not simply. One problem with the framing of these things in Marxist theory is that production is assumed to be the production of material objects, and the production of human beings is sort of sidelined as reproduction. which in a subtle way sort of suggests that it's almost biological in comparison. I've always disliked that phrase, reproduction. I like to think of it rather as the production of human beings. So I think alongside that idea of the production of urban environment, we're also producing each other. Which is, again, a process which cannot actually be reduced to the standard categories of political economy. And I think that it would be necessary, if we have any understanding of what's happening across America and why this movement seems to have coalesced and taken on the breadth and depth that it has, we need to think about that in terms of the confluence between debt extraction and the creation of human beings. I will give an example. I don't know if people are familiar with the We Are the 99% Tumblr page. It's a page where people are invited, largely people who are too busy working to actually take part in occupations, to sort of put in their own contribution by taking pictures of themselves with little signs where they tell their life story, their situation, always ends with I am the 99%. Now, somebody did a word count analysis of the little statements, and some of them are really touching and moving, of the depredations of indebtedness, the problems, insuperable problems that ordinary people are facing under the current economy. So we went through the signs and he, sort of, some computer geek, sort of counted up the words, and we discovered that the word that's used most is jobs, word number 2 is debt, and so forth and so on. Did the top 20 words, and he said, well, the fascinating thing is that nobody here is demanding dignity of work. They're not demanding workplace democracy. They're demanding the means to exist. And he actually went back to a quote that I had taken from Moses Finley. What is that? A quote that I had taken from Moses Finley that, in the ancient world, there's one revolutionary program, which was essentially cancel the debts and redistribute the land. Which is, he said, the demands of a peasantry, not an industrial proletariat. They're basically saying, just give us the means for a basic existence. Now, the reason I thought this was interesting is I started looking at it, and I thought, well, yeah, but this shows the kind of limit of this kind of statistical word count analysis, no matter, yeah, I'm almost done. Not how sophisticated, because if you look at the actual signs, there's something really profoundly more going on here, and I want to introduce this. First of all, 80% of the people who contribute to this page are women. And almost all of them, including the men, are involved in what you might call the caring or helping industries. They're in education, they're in medicine, nursing, doctors, they're in social service provision of one kind or another. And the message that I saw over and over again is a justification of that kind of work and a complaint that essentially if you want to do a kind of work where you're caring for other people, if you want to do work where you're not simply in it for the money, where you're doing something decent and taking care of other human beings, they will put you so deeply in debt that you can't take care of your own family. I think that's the complaint. And that's the thing which is drawing people together across the board. And to understand what's happening, I think just that kind of reimagination of what labor is, what production is a necessary starting place to understand the profound revolutionary changes that are happening in American finance. So
let me just add to that. I mean, one of the organizations that sprang up both nationally and here in New York City was the Excluded Workers Congress. This strikes me as a great idea. You're talking about workers that includes domestic workers, it includes the taxi drivers, it includes all of those workers who actually play a very significant role in supporting urban life. Foundation. And yet they can't be organized in traditional unions because there's no factory gate outside of which you can sort of catch them and get them to sign things. And there are these organizations, and of course it disproportionately involves women, particularly women of color. And you kind of get a sense of what the conditions under which that population live. I mean, when I came back from Argentina a couple of weeks ago, I came in at Kennedy Airport at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I get on the E train coming in from Jamaica at 6:30 in the morning, and it's packed. It's absolutely packed. And it's packed mainly by women and women of color. looking absolutely exhausted, going into the city to wake it up so that the suits can come in and everything is nice and smooth, and they can, they're either going to take care of the kids or they're going to do something of the sort. And that's the population when you start to look at distribution of income in New York City. I mean, this recent study was absolutely astonishing. That there's 1 million people in New York City trying to live on $10,000 a year. Half of the population of New York City is trying to get by on $30,000 a year. And they have no right to the city at all. They have no right to anything. And yet they are the labor force. In many instances, they are the labor force which actually supports daily life in the city. And the calculation is that the 1% actually earns in one day that $10,000, which some people are surviving on. These class disparities, which have grown hugely. This is one of the great success stories, I think, that occupied Wall Street from watching it from far away. So it changed the conversation about social inequality. So now there is some attempt, it seems to me, by the Democratic Party at least to take that up. And I don't have to debate it, and I know you don't either. But they're trying to, at least they're trying to co-opt a little bit of that. And thank God we're now talking about social inequality rather than talking about, austerity of the debt. And at least it's changed the conversation. And I was amused in the newspaper this morning. There was some item that either Obama was proposing a law or is signing a law that says that people should not trade with any government which suppresses dissent. New York City, they were in a really rough time. Very soon. And these are the kinds of things that it seems to me we really have to build upon. The ludicrous hypocrisies that are in the conversation right now. But just going back, the May Day thing is being done partly in collaboration, I guess, with the immigrant rights thing. One of the significant urban events was back in 2006 when the immigrant rights stuff really started big time. There was this proposal in Congress, if you recall, to actually turn illegal immigrants into felons. And that set the immigrant populations off. And the immigrant populations decided they were not going to go to work on several days. And during those days, essentially, Los Angeles closed down, Chicago closed down, this is a tremendous power. Now, if you say the proletariat is everybody who produces the city and reproduces the city, one of the things that, if you want to be theoretical about it, Marx says anybody who transports anything is productive and valuable and this kind of stuff. So all of those vans that are going around New York City delivering things and pressure, they're actually part of value-producing labor. They are part of the proletariat. Now, transport workers' strikes are actually pretty effective. The French used it several times over the last few years. And of course it was used negatively in Chile way back in 1973. So if you stop the city functioning, this is a tremendous power. This is what happened in one of the examples I use in the book, which is El Alto, which actually stopped the flow of goods into La Paz and brought down 2 presidents in the space of about 2-3 years and paved the way for Morales to be elected. Now, Morales has kind of compromised in all sorts of ways with the neoliberal project. We know that, but on the other hand, this was a revolutionary moment when actually the organisation of the whole city actually had a tremendous kind of impact. But stopping the city moving. Now, in that sense, I always go back. I arrived in the city just shortly after 9/11, and one of the things that struck me was what happens when the city stops moving. And small wonder, about 3 days into it, Giuliani comes on and says, start shopping, go out, get moving. I mean, you can't, because capital is about continuous flow. It's got to be in motion. If you stop the motion, you really stop the whole system. And you see fortuitous events that tell you the same thing. I mean, the cost when those Icelandic volcanoes erupted you know, and suddenly you couldn't fly across the Atlantic. So you've got to think of the city strategically as a space in which you can act and do things which will potentially be disruptive to the flows of capital and transform, if you like, the metabolic relations of the city. Now, if you take that path, of course, you're going to hit police repression and you're going to hit a police riot, but then a police riot doesn't necessarily clear the city either. It can also close it down. So there's a lot of power which resides, it seems to me, in thinking about the urban as a place to organize and as a place to come back together. And I think you're dead right about, for example, my impression is that there's quite a lot of segments of the union movement right now that are prepared to change, I think, their stance. Since the publication of this book, I've been approached by some segments of the TUC in Britain saying, we just looked at this book, we want to talk about it. And actually the trades councils in Britain, which were sort of geographically specified, had a much stronger sense of organising the proletariat than the sectoral unions did. The sectoral unions typically said, we're going to look after the mine workers, we're going to look after the metal workers, we don't care about anybody else. But if you're a trades council and you're looking after all of the workers in Oxford or all of the workers, you know, then actually you start to say, well, what is the proletarian condition? And you start to be concerned about conditions of life and housing and the sewage and the sanitation and all those other things that actually affect things. And of course, the labour councils in this country really have traditionally been regarded as rather secondary instruments within the labour movement, but I think there's a stronger sense now with some elements within the labour movement, Bill Fletcher and other people like that, sort of arguing, well, we should be really, you know, Bill Fletcher was the one who proposed to me the question, how do you organise a whole city? And I said, Bill, I think this idea how, but this is something we clearly should be thinking about, and we have to think about it in this new way. So that to me seems to be, you know, just to reiterate some of the arguments that occur within it. But I'd like to backtrack just a little bit to say that the other thing in the book is to realise how significant urbanisation is in the history of capital accumulation. There's a wonderful statement that came out of the San Francisco Reserve Bank that says America gets out of crises by building houses and filling them with things. And actually, since the 1930s, that's what they've done. Actually, you look at the data since the 1930s, that effectively is how the United States has been stabilized. For the first time, housing construction went below the one, you know, way down back to 1940s levels in 2009. And again, this is the end of an era where we can get out of crises by building houses and filling them with things. We cannot do that in this country at this time. It's impossible. There's so many surplus houses around. You can't do it. So recognizing the importance of urbanization to capital accumulation, what we see is a certain blockage to getting out of the crisis through an urbanization project. The one part of the world that is doing that big time is China. And they're booming at 10% because they're building cities at a crazy kind of rate. But again, there's a great deal of protest being organized around that. So I'm kind of very hopeful about some of this, but I'm still bothered somewhat by the scale question. So I wonder, David, if I could ask you to talk a little bit more about how you think this kind of question of organizing at different scales might be approached as a conversation. What would be the talking points? I'm not asking you for a solution.
Just before you begin, maybe if people could, with questions, could pass their cards down to the end, and we'll begin to collect them.
Well, yeah. I mean, essentially, on the question of scale, I think that when you talk about horizontality and hierarchy, you know, we're talking about issues which everybody has to grapple with on some level. And I think you're right that there has been a reluctance to talk about some aspects of that in realistic terms, partly because people want to take a principled position, and if they aren't faced with an immediate problem, it will cause them to recognize that some of those principles will have to be at least moderated in practice or become more complex in their application. Well, why think about it if you don't have to? So I am actually an avid devotee of the notion of horizontality, but I see horizontality a little bit like the way that someone like Noam Chomsky talks about anarchism as being anti-authoritarian. He says that it's not like there is no possible form of authority that will ever be legitimate. For example, I see the authority of a teacher as being something that will always exist to some degree or another in any society.
Now you become a teacher, you say.
Well, yes. I thought that even when I was. I like my teachers. This is why I became one. But it's because, authority of a teacher is essentially self-destructive authority, right? If you teach well enough, you no longer have the authority because they know everything you use. Now, however you frame it, though, I mean, Chomsky's point, and others have said the same thing, is that it's not being anti-authoritarian doesn't mean you say all forms of authority aren't necessarily always going to be legitimate. You say you start from the assumption that they're legitimate unless they prove to you otherwise. So I think it's really important to maintain that principle of horizontality in the sense that really all relations should be horizontal unless there is an absolute proof that you need to have some sort of less horizontal organization. And the word vertical is a little ambiguous here. The word hierarchy is a little ambiguous here. And part of the problem, I think, really does come down to language. The word hierarchy can be used, and often is used in two different ways which we conflate. One of which is the notion of taxonomic hierarchies, nested hierarchies, as we talked about in the book. And it is certainly true that once you go up onto any sort of larger scale than a local face-to-face community, you're going to have a notion of levels of inclusion, and which are a form of hierarchy in one sense of the term. But what anti-authoritarians object to is not the notion of nested hierarchies in that sense. What they object to is actually linear hierarchies, so not hierarchies of inclusion, but hierarchies of exclusion. But what happens is that over and over again, hierarchies of inclusion become the basis for hierarchies of exclusion. So you have more and more inclusive levels, but those people become the representatives of those more and more inclusive levels, become exclusionary groups, which are thus become sort of set apart from the people that they represent. The question, of course, is how to make sure that doesn't happen. And historically, there are approaches that have been used. I actually think that we haven't really examined history closely enough to think about the ways that it can be done. There are people such as in Alto, Zapatistas, the notion of recallable delegates. This is rotation approaches that have been experimented with. I think there's a lot more things that we would probably want to think about. One thing that really struck me recently, the other book here, was a French political theorist named Bernard Manin, who wrote a history of representative democracy, who pointed out that the notion of elections through most of Western history were not considered the democratic mode of selecting leaders. It was considered the aristocratic mode of selecting leaders. These, elections between people who consider themselves the best and then choose which one is best of all. The democratic mode of selection was lottery. Basically jury duty, except it's voluntary. You don't have to sign up. You throw your name in the hat, they give you a basic competence test, and then they just choose a name. And Athens actually did that. Florence, other democratic systems have actually operated quite successfully with this for hundreds of years. So there's a lot of different ways you could organize these things which would prevent the obvious problems of linear hierarchies emerging. I think we haven't begun to explore that, so I don't think that's so much a problem. What I think the problem is how to get there in terms of, we both take this on, if you haven't destroyed the overarching capitalist world system, any enclave is going to be inherently compromised. The real question is how to organize a dual power situation. Once you've achieved autonomy, how not to have it immediately compromised by having to exist and have access to basic resources within a system which is essentially rigged against it. There are a lot of different ideas about this, but in my recent book, which I haven't done yet, I actually map out 4 different possibilities, and this is really a way of getting to start thinking about the question, but it might be useful. I call them the Sadr City approach to dual power, the San Andres Accords approach, the El Alto approach, and the Argentine approach. So if you are creating prefigurative institutions, alternatives, whether on a local level, an urban level, whatever level it may be, how do you relate to larger power structures? Well, what we saw, actually groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Sadrs in Iraq, actually a very interesting approach to dual power. It's not as often explored as such as I think it should be. So the Sadrs did, for example, they knew that if you're going to create alternative institutions, what you have to do is you have to start with something that no one could possibly object to. Something so obviously benevolent that no one could complain about it, and then build an army around to protect it. So what they did was they started with free clinics for pregnant and nursing mothers. Pregnant women and nursing mothers. Who could possibly object to that? And then they built a militia system to protect it and sort of gradually created an infrastructure where they came to dominate urban neighborhoods. The problem is how you then relate to the larger national system. And gradually, almost inevitably, they got thrown into local politics and then into national politics. This happened in the Middle East, wherever the sort of right-wing populists did that. So this seems to be a pitfall. Not the direction I think we would want to take, but we don't want to throw that as the first one. The second one was the Zapatista approach, which I thought was actually quite interesting. The San Andres Accords. They had a brief, basically 10-day insurrection, quickly said, okay, we're going to negotiate. They had these autonomous self-governing communities. And what they essentially did was they had a long negotiation with the government, even though they knew the government was negotiating in bad faith and would never enforce the treaty, simply because the process of negotiation allowed them a space in which to develop their own economy, and an excuse to have democratic consultancies and actually build up their democratic structure. Not sure what an equivalent of that would be for Occupy Wall Street, perhaps some sort of constitutional amendment, or using some sort of process where we don't have to endorse candidates. The El Alto approach, I think, is more sophisticated, but we have to get there. What's really interesting, if you read the writings of not Morales so much as his vice president, he writes quite explicitly that this is an experiment in dual power. What they're trying to do, they have groups like El Alto, which are self-organized communities. And on top of that, they have a political party, which they've placed in power, but could just as easily remove. Because what you do is you basically change the terms of engagement with the state. Where these self-organized communities have the power and the legitimacy to use forms of direct action to overthrow governments if they have to, essentially stage insurrections. And then you say, all right, we've got our guy in there, and we know there's structural constraints on anybody with government. They have to make all these compromises with the world system, with the local bureaucracy, which is not set up to be democratic. But that's okay, because we can kick them out of power at any time. And you make sure that they know that, you make sure that everyone knows that, and that in itself gives a certain power to David Morales to stand up to the authorities, because you can say, well, look, my constituencies could kick me out at any time. Of course, in order to get there, this is what I say to Occupy Wall Street people, we can enter the political process, but only once we've changed the terms of engagement where insurrection is legitimate in America, then it'll be okay. The fourth approach, which I think is what we're doing now as a default, is the Argentine model, which was successful in its own way, which is utter delegitimation. I mean, the one ace in the hole we have is that most people don't consider the government particularly legitimate anyway. If I remember the statistics I was seeing the other day, a larger percentage of Americans would like to see the U.S. become a Soviet communist system than approve of Congress. It actually shows that, interestingly, that 10% of Americans actually would accept the Soviet communist system. 9% approve of Congress. So, most people hate politicians and think they're corrupt anyway. The Argentine model was essentially, you have your insurrection, you overthrow the government, you create alternative institutions, the famous slogan, "Los que se vayan todos," so they can all go to hell, roughly translated. And it got to the point where politicians basically couldn't go to restaurants. This is your aim. Without having to wear phony mustaches and things like that, because people would throw food at them. So once you get to the point where the entire political class is delegitimated, they have to do something. And what Argentina did, and we all know, they defaulted on their debt. And Nestor Kirchner was not the sort of person, incredibly moderate social democrat, comes into power to a point where the entire political apparatus has been utterly delegitimated, it kind of has to do something radical. We could create a situation like that. It's probably the most practical thing we could do with the balance of forces existing as they are in America, but it's kind of the default strategy. And I think the other models provide interesting possible directions of how we could work from there. So let's start with that.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions. Actually, I have a question first. Where exactly where do the suburbs figure into this? I mean, America is mostly suburbs.
Well, that's part of the ruinous capitalist urbanization that I talked about. You know, while the right to the city is a good slogan, the right to the suburbs, yuck. I mean, this is part of when we talk about the right to the city in particular, there's a real question as to where does the city begin and end. The suburbs, you have very urban stuff, and it was a complicated thing to talk about.
Okay, I have a whole pile of questions. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible. So here's the first one. Given that immigrants are, one, an important section of the labor force, and two, that they're largely undocumented, therefore not organized as unions, what kind of role can they play, or have they played in movements like Occupy Wall Street?
Oh,
Well, I don't think, I mean, you talk about...
I've already talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, but, I mean, I think what happened in those immigrant rights marches back in 2006 was a lot of them documented didn't go to work. And a lot of businesses had to close down for that. So, and actually, what's so interesting right now, you see reports from what's going on in California and a lot of the agricultural, they can't get the labor right now to pick the fruit. And in fact, businesses are really suffering from the fact that this tightening of the immigration laws is actually creating all kinds of disruptions to capital accumulation, which is very curious side effect. So I think they have a lot of potential power, but of course it's very difficult to exercise. And that's why the leadership of the legal migrants becomes absolutely crucial to sort of providing an umbrella situation in which many of the legals can participate in some way.
Can independent political parties play any valuable role in freeing people from onerous debt, rent, etc.?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to see them try. I'm an anarchist. I don't do this myself. But the American political system is rigged to make it as difficult as possible for that to happen. There are things that can happen on a local level, I think, that can't happen on the national level, which I think we should think about. Yes, I had a somewhat uncomfortable position earlier today. Well, a silly costume for that they trundled me out at the last moment with the Green candidate for president. And I was like, this is great. No one told me about this. We kind of ripped up a check together. But I think that political parties serve a propaganda purpose more than anything else, because it's almost impossible for political parties to actually gain national traction. The entire system is built up in such a way that we have to remember that the political structure that we have is a structure that was created to prevent democracy. This is what people don't remember. That I always like to annoy people by pointing out that nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. People who wrote those documents hated democracy. They were utterly against it. In fact, I read a quote from John Adams, who was very explicit: majority vote. You can't have a majority vote. The first thing they'll do is they'll abolish the debts and redistribute the land. We read a lot of classics. So they set up the system to, basically prevent democracy. And in the 1830s, they renamed it democracy because people got elected on that platform. So suddenly everybody was a Democrat. But it's a system that's really designed to make it as difficult as possible for democratic voices to actually work through the system, even before it became a system of pure institutionalized bribery.
So here's a question about organizational forms. So you mentioned Murray Bookchin in your book, in Rebel Cities. What do you think about his notion of confederated general assemblies or popular assemblies as a way of as creating a form
Hopkins were all geographers, and of course they had great influence on many of the urbanists like Patrick Geddes and then Louis Mumford and so on. So a lot of thinking about cities from a radical perspective has come out of the anarchist tradition. So I have a lot of admiration for some of the works of my book Chip, because he takes on some of these questions. I also have some criticisms and stuff like that, but I feel I'm in dialogue with him, because I think, as I recall, and you'll probably tell me if I get this wrong, the Federated Assemblies are supposed to be really about, this is a Saint-Simonian notion, they're supposed to be about the government of things, not of people. That seems to me to be a very difficult divide to maintain, particularly when you get into the question of the global commons and how they can be managed. If there are problems with the global commons, and we see that in something like global warming, then there are things that may need to be done which do actually intervene in the way in which people behave and have impacts on how people behave. And that's where you get into the same question: is it all from the bottom up, or is it, what's the balance between the power relations? And I once wrote a utopian sketch called Vimeo, which was sort of appendix to Spaces of Hope. One of the points I made was that you probably need to have global commissions, at least to inform the population as to what the nature of the global problems might be, because I don't think that anybody sitting in any particular commune somewhere would necessarily be aware of, say, a global process like ozone hole or depletion of biodiversity or those kinds of aggregate things. So there has to be some way of creating an information source that at least then poses these problems to action at the local level, which would then have considerable influence, I think, over the actions at the local level, and then what to do if no action is taken at the local level, because, as we often know, if you ask everybody to economize some way or other, then you do get a common issue, which is, I decide, oh, well, I won't bother, let everybody else do it. And of course, if everybody decides that, then you get no action. So I think the commune decided, for example, that, well, it would not, it understood manage the problem, but everybody else was going to work on it, so that was all right. So there were issues of that kind, which would come up, and they need to be thought about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of technical expertise is often left out of this. And again, it's harder in that case to go back to the past because they had options available to them that we don't anymore. For example, in ancient Athens, all the sort of technical, the engineers or the technical roles that you needed to have permanent people, they just got slaves. So, there's no chance that they're really taking on autonomous power, but we can't really do that. I think that the thing about Bookchin that I would add is that Bookchin tended to dichotomize unduly. And one problem with his work is that he has this tendency over and over again, if there's a sort of subtle problem, what to do with lifestyle anarchism versus social anarchism, how do you square personal liberation with ultimate social liberation, he just say, well, one is completely good and the other is completely bad. Social anarchism is great, lifestyle anarchism sucks, this has nothing to do with it. And he did the same thing with direct democracy and worker control. And I think this is what key flaw in his vision is that he says, all right, there's a subtle question that we all have to handle in any sort of democratized society, which is how do you square the problem of one principle which says all those people engaged in a project should have say over how that project is done, and the second principle, which is all those people affected by a project should have some say in how that project is done. Now, one of them, if you take it exclusively, leads to pure workers' control. The other leads to sort of general direct democracy on every level. Well, clearly, some compromise between the two principles has to be worked out. And it just seems reasonable. If there's a factory, then people in the surrounding community really don't care about their vacation policy, but will probably want to have some say over what they do with the river. That doesn't make sense. Bookchin kind of goes just one way. Says, no, worker control is totally wrong. Get rid of it. Only direct democracy. So there's an inherent flaw in the system which allows him to kind of create a purism which would never actually exist if people started really doing this. So I think that what we would end up is a system of much more heterogeneous than anything that these sort of abstract theorists envision. A lot of the problems that will arise, we have like contrasting principles and have to square them in some reasonable fashion, are ones we can't even probably imagine right now. But so these are really thought experiments, let's sort of carry on more than anything else.
Yeah, I agree with that. He said all Marxists are all wrong as well. So. Yeah. But he was actually he was very nice and actually extremely respectful to me a couple of times I met him. I was expecting to walk in the room and him say, "Listen, Marx," but he didn't do it. I was quite surprised.
All right, so a point of agreement between you two seems to be that stopping the flows on which capitalism is dependent is a goal and strategy for creating and asserting popular power. What are the flows around which organization or putting on the brakes is even possible today? Oh, health. That's what it is.
Oh, okay. Well, where do we start? You want to take that if you want?
Well, you start.
All right. I mean, you know, when we were talking about the right to the city, you have Seth Bachman, the cartoonist. He has this wonderful poster he often does for us, which draws a picture of sort of tall building that turns into a raised fist at the end. And the slogan is, "We made the city, we can shut it down." And I think that there's layer on layer where it's possible to do this, but the entire part of the big problem is that another element of work that we haven't talked about is security work. I mean, we have insane percentages of our population doing what economists sometimes call guard labor, depending on how which is supervising, providing security for, everyone from German and white watchmen to police to spies to supervisors at work. It's a little like in this great Civil War. I believe every 3 soldiers there was like 1 guy to shoot them if they ran away. We have a very similar situation in capitalism today. I think it's maybe 20%, and the percentage of people involved in guard labor, surprisingly enough, goes up the higher the degree of social inequality in the society. So a country like Denmark has the lowest level of guard labor. America has one of the highest in the world. Which is one of the problems that a very large percentage of the proletariat are employed to physically threaten the rest of the proletariat, or those people who make the city. There's a limited number of things. There are things that people can do because there is a degree to which, if you are working especially within the grounds of labor organizing, there is a kind of a sympathy that you can get that you won't get otherwise. I've noticed this rather dramatically myself in the case of sabotage and direct action. Police, I'm part of the IWW. We've done actions where we've done pickets where, it's a bunch of black blockheads who are exactly the same guys who might be like breaking into an Oakland, dressed exactly the same, red and black banners, but they're IWW, they're picketing. And suddenly, we're sabotaging trucks and the cops are kind of looking the other way. Letting us get away with murder, which, they would just immediately be put us in jail if the same people had been doing that in a different context. So I think ultimately there is a way to appeal on small levels that way. And we have to remember that at some point, when we win, it's because they refuse to shoot at us. The security forces will have to choose sides at some point. And that's going to be a key juncture. Before that, I think that we need to think very hard about how to operate within the confines of such a system. I think the breakdown will happen largely because I actually honestly believe that capitalism can't really afford the degree of guard labor and securitization that it's created. I mean, one of the big problems is they put all of their weapons in this incredible level of militarization, securitization, and propaganda to the degree that they created a system whereby anybody thinks of challenging the system in any way blocking the flows is inherently impossible. Direct action is impossible. Alternatives to capital is impossible. The cost of doing that is so high that it's actually destroying capitalism. I'm personally convinced of this. So the one thing that they've achieved is that none of us think that there's anything else is possible and there's anything we can do about it. Now we're watching the whole thing dissolve in front of us, and the one victory they've had is that we're all sitting here dumbfounded without any idea what we can do.
I often think about how successful Bin Laden was. That flows through airports these days are very expensive, with tremendous cost. Homeland security now costs an immense amount, and whether we're talking about direct and indirect costs, which have been visited on the American people and actually globally through having to sort of secure the flow from interruption. But there are other things I would think about. I mean, for example, when you think about the city as the metabolism of the city, one of the ways in which El Alto succeeded was to cut off the food supply into La Paz. The bourgeoisie basically lives in La Paz, and El Alto live up on the plateau. They cut the food supply, so the bourgeoisie had to live on canned beans and things like that. This was very effective. So I think that if you imagine a very sophisticated labor organization right back down the food chain, from the supermarkets right back into the farm, and that is well organized, and I think actually there are elements in the IWW that are trying to organize that.
Absolutely, that's our idea.
that whole food chain. Then you would have considerable power. And I'm not talking about just blocking the whole thing and then sort of saying, well, okay, everybody starve, because we would starve too, and that's not the idea. The idea is to have a certain power over a flow, in relationship to a flow, in which you can exert that power and use it. For example, a lot of people involved in that food chain are illegal immigrant workers and so on.
Most of them, yeah.
Use that power in that chain to gain significant benefits for that population. At the same time as you use that power, and you try to, you then always have to sort of go to the final consumer and say, do you realize the labor conditions that exist right the way through here? So if there's some disruption and you cannot get your favorite vegetables because we're cutting off the food supply, then sympathize with it. And actually, it's often not hard to develop that. I mean, I think one of the things that was key in the French transportation strikes was that the majority of the population sympathized very much with the strikers. And even though they were inconvenienced and they had to, walk or bicycle or find some other way of getting to work or not getting to work, there was still considerable sympathy there. And I think the same thing has taken place in Chile with the student strike there. That the recent polls, I was in Chile for 1 week. There was that. About 70% of the Chilean population actually supports what the students are asking. And this is, and I think President's popularity rating is now about 20%. So it tells you this is having a terrific political impact upon the political situation. And that, of course, is against a strike of occupation for a year or more in high schools and all the public universities. Very solidarity. It's very, very sophisticated piece of action. So what's being looked for here are ways to organize and mobilize so that you have some power by saying if we withdraw our labor, if we cut the supply, then this can be extremely disruptive. And capitalism is extremely vulnerable, it seems to me, to any disruption of the flows. And so therefore we should think about strategies to try to get power in relationship to those flows, not necessarily to just cut them off and then kind of say, well, we're going to walk away from it by, I don't know, putting down the electric grid or something like that and walking away. see lots of ways in which you can start to organize around that challenge.
It's also critical to have the potential to do things. It doesn't mean you have to actually do it. I mean, for example, this is a weird case I heard recently. One reason why the Zuccotti Park occupation was successful when we decided not to kick us out right away was, I know a Rolling Stone reporter who talked to a lot of the police officials and other city officials, was all those guys in the Guy Fawkes masks. They were convinced that, you know, if they did evict, Anonymous would like hack their credit card accounts. You know, just having any kind of plausible threat like that will change their behavior.
All right, so I'm afraid we're out of time, so this one final question. This isn't really a question. David Graeber mentioned Occupy Farms. Occupy Farms needs a band. If you have a band we can use, please email occupy-farms@googlegroups.com.
Very important. It's a great work they're doing.
So if you have a band, please email them.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you for joining us. Please check us out at the Haymarket Book Table.